Set in a very tumultuous time, in a very tumultuous city, one label has come to stand the test of time and really become the messenger of a new sound and a new era in jazz. Many young stallions came through this label in the earliest days of Blue Note, and a few course corrections and changes were made. But the Hall of Fame of jazz players houses many of the Blue Note great artists. From Thelonious Monk and Miles Davis to the great hard bop cats Lee Morgan, Hank Mobley, Horace Silver, Art Blakey, and Donald Byrd. The label gave opportunities to generations of young black men who were able to find a career path in the arms of two open-armed Jewish immigrants from Germany. And together they helped change the course of modern jazz as we know it and hear it, and as we still remember it today. How you doing, everybody? Of course, my name is Dan, the Jazz Shepherd, as most of you are well aware at this point, I would imagine. I hope you all enjoyed that Savoy series we did last week, and keep sharing that and letting people know about it. It's a great tool to get to know what Savoy was about. But today we're going to discuss Blue Note, the 1500 series. And it's really, for my money, probably the most important jazz series and sequence of releases in jazz history. It's an incredibly focused and virulent time, and the music reveals that same focus and that same testament to a people dealing with depression. Most of America would have been familiar with this. Piano Cocktail Lounge. This is Monica Lewis. She's a fine singer. Beautiful tone, some vibrato in there, but it's very saccharine. It has some sorrow in it, but it doesn't have the aggression. It doesn't have the tension. It's music for the brokenhearted. And for the most part, pop music dealt with heartache and love. And this is a fun record. It was hard to find. There's a 10-inch of this I'd like to track down eventually. Along came the black musicians of this era, and the sound of Blue Note was very different. It's filled with aggression and tension, and no label captures that hard bop movement quite like Blue Note does. I wanted to show you the Monica Lewis just to give you an idea of what the contrast was between what the average person was listening to and how Blue Note sounded. It's a night and day difference. It's the Blue Note music was enough to make white America uncomfortable. It stood for something a little bit more. It had a tension that was a little greater. And I want to leave this on just for a minute here in the background because I don't think it's going to get taken down. As I pulled this session together, the one thing that really stood out as compared to Savoy was how much more familiar most of these titles will be to jazz collectors. They're almost all available in multiple reissues and printings. A lot of them are currently in print now from multiple sources. Multiple countries around the world have reissued these records. So it's not very often when you go to look for a Blue Note title and you can't find a copy of it anywhere. And that includes the 1500 series. As I was pulling these records, I just went around my shelves and said, okay, that's a 1500 artist. They had some records in that series. And I just kept doing it without looking. I didn't look at my lists or my book or online. I'm like, okay, yeah, that. And I ended up pulling 97 out of the 100 without having to think hard. That's how well I know this series and know exactly which Blue Note artists are in this series and which aren't. There's some interesting Blue Note artists that are giants that don't appear in the 1500 series. They come later. And so it's a very unique set of stable artists that the Blue Note houses in the late 50s that records this 1500 series. And this is the genesis of quote-unquote hard bop via the thesis. This is as hard bop gets. Some of the stuff that happens in the late 1500 series. It's a pretty incredible series. The only 3 records I didn't remember to pull off of just remembering and looking around going, okay, that artist was the Cebu Martinez Congo record, which if I'd have thought longer I would have thought of it. And then of course the 2 Lewis Smith records, who come along in the late 1500 series. He's a great trumpet player. I'm a big fan of those records, but that was one of the guys I didn't think of for some reason. I'm like, oh, and I didn't spend straining my brain. This was just a simple exercise. How much can I just pull? And with Savoy, it was maybe half of that. There was a lot more having to go to the book and go, okay, where is that? Oh, random Y, random T, random length, pull stuff out. With the Blue Note 1500 series, it's all very familiar. And I've had these all for 10, 12 years at least, and so I know them all as well as I know anything in jazz. And I also makes me understand just how unique and different the Blue Note kingdom is. It's a very unique testament to an interesting time. It's a bit like a label in hip-hop called Ruckus, who came along in the mid-90s, late 90s, issued some really great conscious hip-hop. Its biggest names would be Talib Kweli, Mos Def, and maybe Common, who I don't think Common even put out full lengths. He might have done one, but it was kind of a conscious underground black hip-hop label movement. And if we went to hip-hop 50 years from now, and this label was seen in such reverence that it actually had become honorated above most of the actual chart-topping record sales, poll-winning artists. A lot of them have been forgotten, and it was this one kind of almost underground label that had ascended to become the cream of the crop. And that's kind of what Blue Note has done here. It's very synonymous to that kind of a thing where none of these artists or their sales or their poll positions would have been verified in those years. They were all pretty obscure guys. Interesting in the 1500 series we're going to look at is how Blakey only has some live stuff. He's under contract at Columbia, he's under contract at Bethlehem Pacific, Jubilee, so he doesn't get a lot as a leader in the 1500 series that's not live. But there's some great live stuff there, don't get me wrong. Jackie McLean doesn't show up until the 4000 series. Stanley Turrentine doesn't show up. The great Donald Byrd shows up plenty as a sideman. But again, he's under contract to Transition. He has a record at Savoy. He's making some records at Prestige. And so Byrd is not making records as a leader on Blue Note in the 1500 series yet. The 3 Sounds also don't show up as well, if I said that already. And the one guy who does show up consistently and makes great records as a leader is Horace Silver, the Silver Lining. And we'll come back to Horace Silver in a minute, but I want to now dive into some of the history. So in 1939, a young Jewish immigrant from Germany makes that great trip across the ocean. We talk a lot about the Great Migration in America. Well, there was an earlier migration from Central and Eastern Europe that happens post World War I, even obviously turn of the century. The migration is well underway, and New York is having this influx of labor and ideas from all over the world. The ideas of socialism and the worker are kind of arising in Eastern Europe, and this crop is coming across. That journey across the ocean was an arduous 2-week-long journey in bad seas at times. Most of them came across broke and penniless, and that was no exception for young Alfred Lion. He saw the ascension of the Nazi Party in Germany and what it meant for him as a young Jew, And as a guy that had already been moved by jazz in Berlin, where there was interesting things happening in the art scene, he immediately recognized that Germany wasn't going to be the place for him in the long term. And so he goes to New York, and he starts Blue Note almost right away. He finds Meade Lux Lewis, James P. Johnson, Albert Ammons, some of the great Harlem Stride piano players, and he starts recording stuff with them. And he's actually funded by a partner of his by the name of Max Margulis. And Max Margulis was a communist, very heavily into that train of thought, but he was the money behind the capital behind the Blue Note enterprise, ironically enough. And he stays with the label for 10 years before he gets bought out of the business. But Alfred starts to get things underway, and then he calls for his friend from Germany, Frank Wolf, to come over and assist him. And they're childhood friends. They can't be separated. They share a vision and understand something that the European Jew understood frequently, was the desperation and the thirst for freedom that the American black migrant worker was seeking for. They understood what drove the art. It was the oppression and the need for freedom in spite of it. And there's no question that Frank and Al were moved by the Negro's determination and willpower. And obviously there was plenty of opportunity in the 30s going into the 40s to make inroads in the black recording industry. Throughout the history of jazz, it was more recorded by the white players. The first records were recorded with white jazz musicians who had borrowed this music from the African American Negro. And they had heard its energy, its vibrancy, its immediacy, its urgency. And so these young white kids who played it with a sincerity most often, but they still got the opportunities and made the financial windfall that the African American male wasn't getting. And the bands that were being hired by whites were always going to be white bands. And so there's a lot of black players who have limited opportunity to record, to make a living. And Alfred had a great empathy. And he saw the black man as his brother. And if you hear the brothers from the label speak about him, it's pretty much a love affair. Frank as well. Frank was more to himself, from my understanding, and Albert was much more of the handshaking, hugging, dancing. We're going to make some changes. I think they both understood the importance of what they were doing, but Alfred's mission was Alfred's mission, and Frank was just the greatest number 2 of all time. And of course, Frank Wolf was responsible for almost all of the great Blue Note photography, and we'll discuss that more later on in this episode. But they record Albert Ammons and Meade Lux Lewis in 1939, and they start having a little bit of success with that. In 41, Alfred Lion gets drafted, and he's forced to serve in the Army. And if I recall, he gets shipped off to Texas, and he brings his current girlfriend down there for a while, but he's still trying to preserve the Blue Note industry and business that he had started. He ends up using a friend of his named Milt Gabler, who runs the Commodore Music Store, to preserve and store the Blue Note business. And the Commodore Record Store, which was originally run by Milt Gabler's parents, who were Jewish immigrants from, one was Russian and one was Austrian. And they had this record radio shop called the Commodore Radio Store, and Milt took it over, and he eventually puts a record press in there, and he starts preserving this music. He was one of the first to buy and resell old stock. He'd buy old labels as they were going out of business and resell their stock as well. He was one of the first to do reissues of old material and to do original mail ordering of LPs. He kind of initiated the idea of collecting and preserving great recordings. And he records people like Bessie Smith, Frank Trumbauer, Bix Beiderbecke, Miff Mole. He ends up recording Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. Billie Holiday was a customer at Ira Gitler's store, not Ira Gitler, sorry, Milt Gabler's store. And Billy couldn't get Columbia to record Strange Fruit, so he ends up being recorded on the Commodore label. And he documents others like Bessie Smith and Louis and Ella. He ends up going to Decca Records, and he records Louis and Ella together, Billie Holiday, Lionel Hampton. He works for Corral Records for Decca, Peggy Lee, the Andrews Sisters, and he produced and co-wrote Louis Jordan's Choo Choo Chiboogie. So Milt Gabler's an interesting little side note and history part of the Blue Note story. And after 2 years, Alfred gets dismissed from the war, and he wasn't overseas. He comes back in '43, puts the business back in his own hands, and he starts recording people like Art Hodes, Sidney DeParis, Edmund Hall, and James P. Johnson. And this is kind of during the 78 10-inch era. He's recording a lot of this boogie stride piano, some of the stuff which he had heard in Berlin, and he's trying to preserve what's kind of easy to get at, not huge budget. His budgets were very small, and he had to make cunning decisions on what to record, when, and where. And it's quite an amazing testament that he was able to record as many of the greats as he did, even as a young businessman. He ends up hiring a guy named Ike Quebec, who becomes a talent scout for the label, and he brings a lot of interesting people in for Alfred to check out, and including in 1947 a young Thelonious Monk. And Alfred Lion had to make a decision with his monthly recording budget to record Thelonious Monk or a more established mainstream sellable artist. And this sets the precedent right here for Blue Note. Alfred Lion chose to record a young Monk. And those recordings went kind of unissued for a little while, and they certainly weren't appreciated when they finally were issued. But it's an early indication of the risk in order to preserve this great art that Alfred Lion was going to be willing to take. So as well as recording Monk and other great bebop artists like Tad Dameron, Fats Navarro, Howard McGee, James Moody, and Bud Powell, he's also still recording the great boogie, New Orleans, Dixieland tradition guys like Sidney Bechet and George Lewis. And those recordings continue well into the 50s. And we're, of course, listening to a Bechet 10-inch collection right now from the early 50s. And Bechet is one of the most flamboyant people in the business. So, the label has 3 different headquarters over the course of its independent history. It starts off at 767 Lexington Avenue in the heart of Manhattan's Midtown. And I'm going to show some slides of that. And there's also an interesting artist depiction of RVG, Lion, and Wolf being muraled on the wall. It's not a real mural, it's just someone's idea of this building being preserved and remembered for its important, noble offerings to the American history and legacy. They end up moving in 1957 to 47 West 63rd, which is just on the other side of, just on the east side of Broadway. And Broadway's the grand, brave thoroughfare that starts at the Battery in southern Manhattan, works its way all the way up to Central Park, kind of bending and straightening and bending, and it kind of ends up working its way west towards the top of Manhattan to the west of Central Park. So by this time, 67, 63rd, Broadway's already weaved its way quite a way west. It's what creates a lot of those diagonal intersecting streets, including Times Square and Columbus Circle. So they're right on the heart of a lot of the excitement that's going on in Manhattan. And then 43 West 61st was where they moved to next. and that's from 1960 to 1966, which of course is after the era we're going to cover today. But it's still an interesting part of the history, and of course after this point they sell on to Liberty. There's a famous little P, or what people call the ear, on a lot of the outer grooves of the Blue Note early LPs, and that's a symbol from the Plasti-Lite record pressing plant, and those symbols ended up on almost all early Blue Note pressings. They used that Plainfield, New Jersey company all the way up in 1966, so pretty much up until the sale to Liberty as well. People say it was one of the best vinyl pressing plants in the country, and the P in the runout is something a lot of collectors look for. It's often called the ear, but it's a little scripted P, and the RVG etching as well that you often will see in the outer groove is also an important thing that collectors look for. It's usually an indication that Rudy Van Gelder mastered it and of course engineered the sessions, but Rudy Van Gelder and his connection with Blue Note is well documented. I'm not going to dive into that too deeply, but Blue Note used him in that studio, in that rehearsal space, both at his mom's and when he built his own, pretty endlessly through most of the history of Blue Note. So Van Gelder is an important aspect of the Blue Note family, and people have to remember that in New York, to get to New Jersey, you got to cross either the George Washington Bridge, the Lincoln Tunnel. It could take you a few hours to get there if traffic's bad over to Hackensack, New Jersey, Bergenfield. It's across the way. It's not just down the street. It's sad how little documentation seems to exist of the actual Blue Note studios, offices. I can't really find pictures. I can find pictures of the buildings today, but I certainly can't seem to find pictures of any of the cats hanging outside the offices. You see that most of the photos take place at Rudy Van Gelder's studio and home in New Jersey. And of course, Frank Wolf was there documenting tirelessly the photographs throughout the years. And Wolf's legacy of photography is really unrivaled in the jazz community. So in the early 50s, the 10-inch era came upon the marketplace. And I've talked about it a lot over the years on my channel. It was a really difficult thing for a small independent label to make those type of huge adjustments to inventory and stock on the fly. And it was a daunting task, and as the 50s moved forward, they had to make that transition again to the LP. And again, that was a difficult time. But during the early 50s, he's having again the foresight to record a young Miles Davis, who really wasn't much of anybody at that point. He records J.J. Johnson at that point, and they would get some really good sessions from J.J. Clifford Brown is on some of that work. Gil Mel is doing some interesting work in the 10-inch era for Blue Note. It's a very productive time, but still it's a time of navigating and finding their way. And they almost threw in the towel a few times during this point. And in 1954, as the LP era was dawning, and the major labels have already transitioned to that new stock. They got those shiny 12-inch LPs in the store, and so all these other small labels that are still putting out the 10 inches, they just look outmoded and out of date. And it was so daunting to Alfred to have to make that transition again that he almost sold Blue Note to Atlantic Records in 1954. And what a change that would have been in the course for Blue Note. But it's in this window when a young, incredibly talented, incredibly confident Jimmy Smith is introduced to Alfred Lion and Frank Wolf. And other labels had kind of noticed him too. And Prestige had been told they need to sign him. I think Riverside was kind of curious about him. And Ike Quebec said, no, you have to sign Jimmy Smith. And as the 12-inch era LP is dawning, it's the option of signing Jimmy Smith and going forward, or not signing Jimmy Smith and selling to Atlantic, that really is what facing Alfred Lion. He has to make that choice. And of course, we all know he chose to record Jimmy Smith because what mattered to him was documenting the music, not making money. It's such an important part of the Blue Note legacy. It's the business decisions weren't always the smartest or the best, but the integrity of the music was always what came first. And that's part of what's elevated the Blue Note canon to its high place in people's esteem today. And a lot of people don't even tangibly grasp it. It's just got this brutal honesty that you might not even recognize that that's what it is, but it beats you across the head with this most honest expression of the African American male. And it's a powerful experience to even the non-converted consumer. You don't have to know it or understand it for it to have something that twinges in your gut and makes you feel a little uneasy if you're a white man. And if you're a brother, you feel something a little militant rising up in you when you listen to this music. It's a powerful, powerful antidote for a very difficult time. America's still very much pre-civil rights, and the opportunities for blacks were very diminished. Things were somewhat better in the Northeast, but it was still a very segregated place. Opportunities to record, the work was tough to come by. The great big swing bands had totally been broken down by the economics of the 50s. And a lot of these black guys were just struggling to survive. And it's important to remember Blue Note doesn't sign any of the real big jazz names of the day. As close as you get is Bud Powell, but Bud's first recordings were pretty early in his career. Monk's recordings were very early, his first. Monk wasn't nobody, Monk was a risk. Recording Miles Davis in 52 and 54. Miles wasn't shit. Miles wasn't on his way with Coltrane and Cannonball Adderley and Bill Evans making Kind of Blue. Miles was years from that still. And so recording a young Miles was risky. Recording Clifford Brown and J.J. Johnson, that wasn't a guaranteed outcome. That was ballsy. And it's a tack that they take over and over and over again. And of course, one of the other most important aspects of the Blue Note story is as the LP era dawns and Jimmy Smith comes in, and the first full-length LP of Blue Note music, I believe, is 1500, and I think it's 11 or 12. It's a Jimmy Smith session. He does 3 out pretty quickly right off the bat, and then some other new material starts to show up. But they brought in Reed Miles, who was a fashion designer, graphic novel designer. He worked with advertising, and he wasn't really even a jazz fan. But he was given this creative freedom and license to create these incredible timepieces in art on the music. And he was often given a little bit of nudging in terms of this is what this record's going to be, kind of direction-wise and tone-wise. And it's amazing how well his covers usually match the music and the intensity of the music that's inside. He comes from the Bauhaus school, big blocks of color and photos that are chopped and cropped. And they use the sans serif font with very little decoration. It's just a very simple, and it's amazing how timeless Blue Note album covers look year after year after year once Reed Miles steps into the picture. And so that's kind of the history of the label as it becomes to where we are in 1500 in 1955. We're about to go into this brand new world, and I'm going to quick list off for you some of the great names that record primarily as leaders and a few sidemen as well, just to flesh it out. And then we're going to dive into the records themselves. But on the piano, names like Horace Silver, Sonny Clark, Bud Powell, and Thelonious Monk all make records here. And sidemen were including Hank Jones, Wynton Kelly, and Bobby Timmons, who was soon to be a jazz messenger. On the trumpet, we have the great young Miles Davis, before he was anybody, Lee Morgan, the great Thad Jones from the Basie groups, Clifford Brown, the world-changing Clifford Brown, Kenny Dorham, Donald Byrd, who I said doesn't make a record as a leader, but he's on a lot of the sessions of Mobley and Morgan. The great Louis Smith makes a couple of great records, and Art Farmer shows up as a sideman on actually a lot of records here in the late 1500s. On the alto sax, We have the great Cannonball Adderley, who makes one of the great records in this canon. Lou Donaldson, who's a fiery alto player in the image of Parker. And Sonny Stitt plays ballads and the blues as well as he plays bebop. And then the great John Jenkins makes one record as a leader and a few as a sideman. On the tenor sax, we have the great Hank Mobley, who is the epitome of the Blue Note jazz messenger sound. The great Johnny Griffin from Chicago, who comes in with a ferocious, dynamic jackhammer approach. Clifford Jordan, also from Chicago. Sonny Rollins, who was changing jazz along with a young man by the name of John Coltrane. And oddly enough, it's Blue Train that's the one record that's iconic enough for a non-jazz fan to say, oh, I kind of recognize that. I've probably seen that poster somewhere. You probably saw it in a record store. Blue Train is the one record that has a familiarity to non-jazz fans. Maybe not musically, but that image, that it's something that people will recognize. And I remember as I came to my Blue Note journey beginning, it was the one title that really jumped out. I'm like, oh, I've seen this in documentaries, Blue Train. And then you're waiting for all the other ones that you're going to know and recognize. And it is a second tier label in terms of its popular success. It's certainly grown in popularity in the last 15, 20 years in a way that nobody could have predicted. To see these Tone Poets and the Music Matters and all these incredible deluxe reissues and them digging through the back canon, reissuing the unissued material, it's been a pretty incredible run. Also on tenor, Tina Brooks shows up some as a sideman, and then Dexter Gordon's about to join the fold shortly after. He's also worth a mention here. On the trombone, the great J.J. Johnson makes some incredible music here. Curtis Fuller is one of the leaders of the bebop, hard bop movement with Mobley, Bird, and the Messengers, and he makes some great records. And Benny Green, who's a bit more of a soul swing player, makes 3 or 4 great records in the 1500 series. On the drums, you have Art Blakey, and he's really the foundation of the Blue Note sound, as I've said in numerous episodes before, and he's one of the great architects of the hard bop, driving ferocity, yet melodic and hummable and foot tappable. It's a very interesting mix of high energy and aggression, yet memorable and hummable, which is a great Monin's going to stick in your head when you hear it. You know, that's just the facts of the matter. No other drummer got a leader session during the 1500 series, but you see a lot of guys like Philly Joe Jones, Louis Hayes, Art Taylor, Dave Bailey, not to be confused with Don Bailey, who works a lot with Jimmy Smith, Elvin Jones, Max Roach, and Charlie Persip all play some of the drums in the 1500 series. On the bass, Paul Chambers gets 3 records as a leader, and he's the only bass player to get records as a leader in the series. But Sam Jones also recorded a lot of records. Doug Watkins was on a number of sessions. Wilbur Ware was on a number of sessions. Oscar Pettiford shows up on a couple early recordings. So a lot of the great bass players are present here in the 1500 series. On the vibraphone, Milt Jackson is the name that comes to mind most predominantly. On the guitar, Kenny Burrell has a number of great records. Grant Green's not ready to show up yet. And then on the organ, of course, Jimmy Smith. But in the 1500 series, Jimmy Smith is it. So last I want to touch on a few artists that are going to come up later in Blue Note's canon. But for those of you who are watching and not that familiar with Blue Note, these are names that will show up later in what will be part 2 down the road, the 4000 series. Artists like Herbie Hancock. Young Freddie Hubbard shows up. Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter, Jackie McLean, Tony Williams, Grant Green, The Three Sounds, Stanley Turrentine, Duke Pearson, Horace Parlan, Andrew Hill, Ornette Coleman, Don Cherry, Gracia Moncour, Ike Quebec, John Patton, Babyface Willette, Freddie Roach, Eric Dolphy, Larry Young, and Cecil Taylor. And that's the guys that are going to show up after this 1500 group. So those are all part of the Blue Note legacy, but they're not going to really be covered in this series of episodes. So stay tuned. We're going to jump into the first set of LPs coming up right now.